You are listening to TMI for the week of January 15th, 2018.
Today, Dave speaks to Chris Rouse. For updates and contact information, find his website, newclearfreesolutions.com. We will post related links on our show notes.
I do a lot of work all throughout the Maritimes. I work Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, pretty much anywhere in New Brunswick and PEI. Occasionally, Newfoundland, Labrador. I've worked at Churchill Falls in Labrador.
Huh.
Mm-hmm. I was there once, and it was like minus 60.
Wow.
Yeah, it was cold.
It's hard to imagine. So you're not exactly right next to Point LePreau.
I'm about, as the crow flies, I would probably be around the 60, 70 kilometer range.
Oh, okay.
I would say. Because St. John is just on the edge of 50 kilometers, right? It's like kind of just outside the 50 kilometer zone, and I'm a little bit further past that. So I would say 60, 70 kilometers. I am in the prevailing winds, though, is what really matters.
Huh. Nice, yeah. So now, how did you become interested in New Brunswick's use of nuclear power?
A girl. To be honest, I started dating this girl that was always into being against Point LePreau, and I'm a technical guy. I work for an engineering company, and she asked me to look at things. Fukushima had just happened, and there was a licensing hearing for LePreau. So started looking into things, and I was really concerned with what I was seeing. There's a lot of, it seemed very safe to me.
There's a lot of women in the anti-nuclear movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think, yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, that's what originally got me into it. That's not what kept me into it, I guess. My concern was what I got into it. And I don't even really like to consider myself so much anti-nuclear as, pro-solutions that don't have nuclear included.
Yeah.
I don't like being called an anti-anything, I guess. I work by a set of principles, based on least cost, safety, environmental. I look at the whole big picture, and just nuclear doesn't cut it, I guess. And there's other options. I'm an engineer, and I often deal with safety projects and stuff. And the best way to mitigate safety issues is to just not have the problem in the first place, and that's always the first place you look. So, not having a nuclear power plant is much safer than having one. So it's my thoughts on it.
It reminds me of here in Ontario, a sort of headline is, they hired the most expensive scientists for 10 years to study locating the dump next to Lake Huron. And it seems very little mention of any effort to study other locations. So it reminds me of what...
Just a bad idea to be, it never even should have got as far as it did. It's ridiculous.
Well, it reminds me of what you're saying about nuclear, in that it sounds like there's an arbitrary decision to adopt it, and then a lot of attention on just how to go ahead with it, and very little concern for the other alternatives. And as you say, now wind and solar is now a safer, better alternative.
Yeah, and it's cheaper, I guess, is one of the big things to get broad public acceptance of any energy system is going to be cost. Businesses like low cost. Everybody likes a low power bill, right? So the solutions are cheaper.
So there's sort of a shift going on now. There are these emerging alternatives. Also, I was reading some of the material that you're working on. Incentives, the carbon tax, and it kind of changed the landscape. Also, another change now is there's going to be increased demand if we're switching to electric vehicles. So combined together, with alternatives, different demands, policies like carbon tax, we're kind of in a new landscape now in terms of making our choices.
Yeah, I really think we are, and I really think, it's kind of some of the material I'd sent you, that New Brunswick ended up with a really, really good policy. You can break the problem down into some very basic levels, right? And pick what fundamentally works at a very basic level and develop your policies from that. So, one of the big questions, I think, in not only Canada, but really globally, the biggest probably decision on this transformation that needs to happen is who's going to invest into it? Because who invests it is going to be who makes the money at the end of the day, right?
And so that's the big actors like utilities and large.
So should we do, Canada, and I think New Brunswick has a really good model that I think is a good one to follow, and I think a lot of the provinces are very similar with, we have publicly owned utilities,
right?
And if they invest in renewables and shift all the gasoline, automotive sectors, and our public utilities stand to make a lot of money that can be used for social programs and all that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, if we start investing into it now, we can create a lot of work, a lot of really good work for across the country. So at the end of the day, once the transition has been completed, who makes the money at the end of the day? And the choice is whether it's going to be publicly funded or privately funded. The billion-dollar question, I think, that's not really being discussed. There's none of the public utilities in Canada own windmills. It's ridiculous. We wouldn't let private companies put up dams. We'd all be in an outrage, but we seem to be okay with letting, Warren Buffett put up windmills. He's not putting it up to save the environment. He's putting it up because he's making money off of it. It's the same money that our public utilities could be making.
So let me see if I understand this, and you'll have to correct me. So in the case of the carbon tax,
yep,
you've got a large actor like a giant utility. Mm-hmm. And so what you're suggesting is that the province, because it owns the utility, should incentivize. Let me just finish. So give it some investment money, which in turn reduces the use of carbon, which in turn reduces the tax that utility would pay on the carbon. And in the savings that are generated by these investments, you want to recycle back some of those new earnings or savings back into the very program that the utility would adopt. So they continue to save on some tax. They continue maybe even to reduce both the carbon they use and increase their profits. And yet on top of that, some of those savings go in to further snowball that change. And I guess in the end, it affects jobs that may be created that aren't even counted in that equation. It answers the province's desire to drive forward with cleaner solutions. I guess it sets an example. And it funds itself. Is that pretty much what you're talking about?
The only thing I would change a little bit, and you kind of corrected yourself, was incentive versus investment.
Okay.
And incentive is what most of the other provinces are doing. And let's look to Alberta for an example. They don't own a public utility, but you don't necessarily even have to own a public utility to make this work. It could just be a pool of money that private sector can use, right? When private sector invests in, say, a wind farm, they don't finance the whole thing. It's only about 40% financed by them. It's usually about 60% financed by debt, banks. Banks are the other big picture in it. And the carbon tax could be the bank piece, right? Where where it just supplies that money to the other ones. But if we look to, again, back to Alberta and incentives versus investments, they're taxing their people on carbon and putting this money back in, and they're giving some of it back out in rebates, kind of the revenue neutral thing that a lot of people have been talking about. But they're also taking a big chunk of this money and incentivizing carbon reductions. And potentially they're just giving the money away to private corporations and stuff like that so that they'll invest their money. So they're basically taxing the people and giving the money to private corporations.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference between an investment. Whereas New Brunswick, where we've decided to invest that, it's our investment and it's our return on investment. If you look to the U.S., they actually have a form of a carbon tax based on their tax credits that they're given. Basically, it's a taxpayer-funded carbon tax. The problem with those, and it's an incentive, I guess, for private industry to invest in wind, and it's working. But every time they threaten to take it away, the investments dry up.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, at the end of the day, who's going to make all the money off of this wind power and solar power and all this kind of stuff? We're just ending up creating, instead of big oil companies, we're going to create big wind companies or big solar companies. And those big solar and wind companies can be our publicly owned utilities and should be. There's no reason that Ontario should have OPG windmills.
I hear you. I couldn't agree more. Let me see if I understood or misunderstood one of the points you were making. And this is how it hit me when I was looking at what you're saying. So generally we think of programs that are focused around efficiency and or shifting demand as being great, smart, green ideas, like shifting the time of day users would use more energy or efficiency, generally subsidizing that. And I think one of the charts that I was looking at pointed out that actually it normally benefits the giant users, and there's actually quite low participation in a lot of those incentives. So while on the surface it sounds like a great solution,
efficiency is a really bad policy trap that I've seen. If you look, I think California's fallen into it. Germany's fallen into it. I think Ontario, one of the reasons your guys' rates are so high is efficiency. Efficiency is a policy trap, especially in Canada. I think, especially in Canada, where our grid is already very, very low carbon. We're 65% renewable and about 75% carbon free. Using less electricity from the environmental point of view is a fool's errand as far as I'm concerned. When you back up to the fundamental levels and you have two choices where we can fix the problem on the supply side or on the demand side, you actually can't fix the problem with efficiency, because in order to do that, you have to use zero energy. And it's not an option, that kind of a thing isn't an option. So if you look to New Brunswick, we're investing right now heavily into efficiency, and it's part of the EUB hearings right now. All this money and time and effort put into it, and we get a 5% reduction in emissions, which is a lot of money spent doing nothing, essentially. And again, efficiency for our public utilities. Efficiency drives rates up because the utilities' fixed costs don't change, and when they start selling less electricity, they get less profit, and the fixed costs end up spreading over less kilowatt hours. So it actually drives rates up, which is a fundamental problem if, the whole point of a carbon tax is to, in my mind, increase the price of carbon and help in comparison to the solution. So we don't want to create a policy that makes the solution price go up as well, or the carbon tax becomes kind of useless, right?
It's really an interesting way of looking at it. And you're saying there's quite low participation already, and that the benefiters are these giant users, largely.
Well, I wouldn't say giant users. I would say wealthy people. If you look to New Brunswick, and I asked some very basic questions to NB Power during this hearing, and I asked, what if we just stopped all these efficiency programs and still had the same rate increases that we had, and we don't reduce and shift demand? That's their big cornerstone policy. And if the scenario that they gave me, it's going to cost them, the utility, a publicly owned utility, over $700 million in the next 10 years. That's a lot of money. And I also asked another very basic question. What if we just stopped these efficiency programs, these incentives or subsidies and stuff, and we had zero rate increases? And we can go 3 or 4 years without rate increases. That's like a 6 to 8% rate increase that the rest of us are all paying for.
That's interesting.
And then I asked another basic question, because who's benefiting from the $700 million or rate increases, or because they're kind of essentially the same thing. So I said, what is the ratio of participants versus non-participants? And it's like 99% to 1, like less than 1% of the ratepayers are getting subsidized. And then you look at who is participating in these incentives, I guess. The problem with doing incentives, they have a program where if I insulate my basement, say it costs me $4,000, I have to come up with the $4,000 of my own. I do the thing, and then NB Power will give me back $2,000. Most New Brunswickers don't have $4,000 in their bank account to insulate their basement.
Yeah.
Essentially, only people with extra capital can participate in these. So essentially, it's a real, the whole 99%, 1% Occupy Wall Street kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're doing with these incentive programs.
It's fascinating. So on the other side of it, in Ontario, they were trying to get certain industries to change the time of day they have their peak demand at. Is that an issue in New Brunswick so much?
Well, we're looking at going down those paths, and it's wrong. The behavior that we really need to change, what they're trying to do is save on peak power, right?
Right.
Save us from doing this thing. Peak power is 1 hour of 8,000, how many ever hours there is in a year. It's 1 hour for 1 day that we have this peak power. And we're trying to fix that problem by adjusting our behavior the other 8,000 hours of the year.
Wow.
It doesn't make sense, right? Same with NB Power. They're reducing shift demand programs so they can defer a gas plant in 2027. They're losing all this money, $700 million and all this kind of stuff, to something that they can actually make money off of. Growth is actually good. It's one of the biggest problems in the North American market. I wouldn't say it's just in Canada. I'd say it's in North America. We've gotten fairly efficient already. I think efficiency is something that will happen naturally. If it's a good investment, we shouldn't have to subsidize it. So we're kind of killing our growth, which is bad for business, and it's putting up rates. So efficiency doesn't do any of the things that we think it does.
We think it lowers
cost. We think it lowers costs. It lowers our bills, but it raises our rates. So we're no further ahead.
Your summary of that was that it's because you're trying to control the problem on the demand side rather than the supply side.
Yeah. I think in general, and we're also asking this time of use pricing. Right now, it's set up to be at our peak demands. As we put more variable renewable energy onto the grid, those times of days won't matter as much. And I think you see it in Ontario already. Is some days during peak period, there's lots of maybe even excess wind power, and people are reducing their demand while there's excess power. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
It's that's happening already and will happen. So I think if we're going to try and get people to change their behaviors, let's do something that's meaningful. Like maybe that 1 hour a day, maybe there can be a time of use pricing where on days that it's minus 30, you pay a little bit more, so there's some incentive to reduce on that one day.
Yeah, and maybe there could be an app, and they say, "Hey, for the next 6 hours."
Yeah, it's called critical pricing. Critical pricing, I think it's called. It's an actual model that I think works well. But I think what will happen, you also have to look at what behaviors we're actually trying to change. And if you look at, say, New Brunswick, we have a really high electric heating load, and we actually have a morning peak. It's around 7 o'clock in the morning on the coldest day. So if you look at what's actually causing that peak, it's people getting up and going to work and cooking their toast and having their coffee. That's unreasonable to ask them to change those things.
Right.
They can't get up, work later. I'm sure not going to tell somebody to not make their coffee in the morning. These are things that can't really change right now. I think as we add automotive to our grids, I think they'll largely be charged at home. We can actually use our cars to maybe reduce those peaks, which will be transparent, I think, to most of us, right? So maybe we get up in the morning and we make our coffee from the power in our car battery.
Right.
That's something I think is reasonable.
Yeah, or Elon Musk with his giant batteries, maybe communities would have larger batteries fed by...
Yeah. I think there's some other misconceptions about, and especially Canada. I'm going to speak specifically about Canada because all the grids aren't exactly the same and not all in the same different places and stuff like that. But as far as energy storage goes, we're connected to one of the largest batteries in the world, Hydro-Quebec. The resource that they have up there is spectacular. Their 2016 annual report, they had 124 terawatt hours of energy stored in their dams.
Yeah.
120.
Yeah.
That's the perspective, I guess, for anybody.
Yeah.
That's enough to power New Brunswick for 10 years.
Wow. Okay, so here's, I wanted to get to this. So there's been a suggestion recently, in fact, I think even Kathleen Wynne might have entered into some negotiations to consider buying more power from Quebec Hydro. And I noticed that in your work, you're sort of suggesting a similar policy for New Brunswick. Are we both going to be fighting over Quebec Hydro?
No, I don't think so. I think Hydro-Quebec, they're actually situated. They have one of the largest batteries in the world up in the Labrador. They also have, if you looked at a wind map, also have probably one of the best wind resources in the world as well, parked right beside this big hydro resource.
Wow.
They can supply a significant amount more power than what they are. They might not be able to supply it all on that one cold day, though.
All right.
But they can supply they can supply a lot more power right now, like in the summertime and all kind of stuff like that. They have all kinds of extra capacity in those kinds of scenarios, and that's why I'm kind of promoting maybe a 95% renewable solution at this point, where I really think we need to keep fossil fuels. We just need to stop burning fossil fuels in them. Have them sit there just in case.
Yeah.
Actually, very, very low cost, especially now most of them are already existing plants that have already paid for the money to staff them, which is jobs, which isn't a bad thing, right? But the money to staff them is quite low. Like New Brunswick has a 1,000 megawatt oil-fired plant, Colson Cove, and it's really expensive to run. We only run it a little bit in the wintertime, about 5% of the time. And it only costs about $15 million to staff that place for when we need it. And, NB Power has a revenue of over $2 billion a year. The $15 million is, one damn day at Point LePreau kind of thing.
Right.
It's minimal.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that I think might be a little bit different than a lot of the solutions that other people are providing. I don't think we should necessarily be trying to shut down our coal plants and we just need to stop burning fuel in them.
All the time.
I'm okay with burning some oil in Colson Cove for those 5 days a year.
Yeah.
To get to 95%. And to get to 95%, we're talking 20 years down the road, and we don't know what kind of technologies are going to be available then, right?
Right.
An electrode boiler.
Is that gas?
No, it's essentially an electric hot water heater.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It doesn't have a heating element. It actually uses really high voltage electricity to pass through the water, which creates the steam.
Okay.
They're really versatile. And again, just to back to big picture thing, if you look at where our emissions come from, we've looked at, we think it's a supply side problem. On the demand side is how we use energy. So obviously anything that's using electricity, it's not a problem. We're already using electricity. It's just going to be clean electricity. Then if we look to automotive, we've got electric cars, electric buses, Elon Musk, electric transport, electric trains, the solutions there.
My question about the electrode boiler that's a user side.
Mm-hmm.
That's for heating water or it's not for generating electricity.
No, it's for generating steam. And again, back to the other third of our emissions is from industry. And that's what I work. I work for an engineering firm. I work in industry. I work on boilers a lot of the time. And that's where most of the emissions are coming from. It's from industrial heat and steam that they use for different processes and stuff. And so we can use green electricity in these electrode boilers to produce the steam instead of burning natural gas or oil or
that's exactly, because I think in your discussion it was that you had just finished talking about importing hydro from Quebec, a very green source, and then you got into electrode boilers. And I couldn't figure out if that was on the generation side the steam would be used, or if it was on the user side.
Nope, that's on the user side.
That makes
sense.
And
these boilers, they're not new technology. It's been around for quite a number of years, but it doesn't make sense to use them if the electricity is being supplied by fossil fuels. It doesn't make sense to do that.
Yeah.
Environmentally, cost-wise, it's better to just burn the fossil fuel in the boiler.
Correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of heat wasted in traditional boilers.
Yeah, they're generally about, a really well-performing industrial boiler that was capturing, a lot of the heat can get up to between the 70 and 80% efficiency range, and, the rest of that's going to mostly the stack, I guess, probably. So there's a 20% difference there, whereas the electrode boilers are actually 99% efficient at turning energy into steam. So when you do kind of all things considered, if we use market prices for electricity and the price of natural gas, it's actually a little bit cheaper, not a lot cheaper, but a little bit cheaper to use these electrode boilers.
It's a nerd question. So would some hydrogen be created in that process?
No, but as far as hydrogen goes, I think it will probably end up being part of the solution. I think at some level. I discussed earlier about going to 95% renewable and 5% fossil fuels. That 5% could easily be hydrogen instead of natural gas, right? Hydrogen will probably always be a premium fuel. It'll be more expensive, but it can be actually quite expensive if you don't use a lot. If it's only providing 5% of your mix, it can be quite expensive and still keep rates low.
Find us on Twitter at @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
Half of the province's debt is a result of New Brunswick Power?
Yeah, NB Power, it's not quite half, but I think we're in the close to $5 billion range, and I think the provincial debt's around $12 billion. A big chunk of that was Point LePreau.
Yeah. Well, okay. Mm-hmm. Any idea what percentage?
I think it was about $3 billion or so.
Well, okay. So what I really want to know is what percentage of Ontario's debt is its 20 reactors?
OPG, and this kind of comes back to, I think, Kathleen Manning's thing. OPG actually has quite a low capital structure, meaning that they don't own a whole lot of debt. They've been getting a fair amount of money for their electricity, and they've been building equity with it. So, I think.
Well, see, it's kind of a trick question.
I don't know an actual debt level, but I know that their capital structure of OPG is about 60%. I think 60% equity, 40% debt, which is good. That's actually a good thing.
It's complex because they split up Ontario Hydro after the largest bankruptcy in the history of money, and they split it into OPG and Hydro One. They split the debt between the two organizations. They have been charging ratepayers for stranded debt, but I think half of the remaining debt is held elsewhere in Hydro One. But it's kind of a trick question because I always wonder what costs.
Sure, in Ontario because I don't. Here I intervene in the regulatory hearings. So.
Yeah, but what? Even in the charts that are part of your presentation, you're comparing costs of different forms of generation, and I always wonder what costs aren't included in those figures when you're, for example, comparing nuclear to other sources. Like, we build wings on universities. We have security. There's the land footprint. There's the fact that it'll be never used moving forward. There's all kinds of regulatory costs and exceptions for the entire process from mine to plant. There's the unknown waste costs, which are just unknowable because there aren't any yet. I mean, when we're looking at charts that are comparing these costs, I really wonder how those figures are really, because there's the hidden and deferred costs that are.
They're really underestimating, even in the sources that I provide. the best way to look at what even the costs are without those things is to look at real life. Nuclear in North America is pretty much dead. We're refurbishing some old reactors. As far as new reactors go, there's actually nothing to buy anymore. The company that had any for sale went bankrupt.
That's right.
There's actually nothing to buy anymore if you wanted to build a new reactor, unless you want to get into prototype stuff.
We dodged a big bullet there because the 2 places, 50% of the places there remaining with their plan for the AP1000, 50% have been canceled. One of 2. But
so new nuclear is pretty much vaporware. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really exist.
Wow.
Not over here, anyway.
And so China,
but we get refurbishments and all those kinds of things. So it's still a concern here in Canada for sure.
So let's backtrack a bit. So your organization, Nuclear Free Solutions. Mm-hmm. Now you've changed your focus from picking on Point LePreau to looking at it from the economics perspective.
Yeah, and not just the economics perspective. I think you largely see from the nuclear propaganda machine that it needs to be part of the solution. And I think I've had to look at that for myself. Can we do it without nuclear? And the answer is yes, we can. Not only from an economics point of view, but is it a necessity as part of the solution? And it's not.
Well, in a country where only 2 provinces have any reactors running, it kind of is possible elsewhere to survive.
Well, if you look at Canada's grid right now, we're about 65% renewable. There's no study in the world that's saying that we can't do 30, 35, 40% variable renewables on top of that.
Yeah.
So we don't need it. And if you don't need it, and it costs more, and it's not safe, and there's all these other hidden costs, nuclear power is underperformed in every aspect of power generation, from capital costs, O&M overruns, capacity factors, every major component of owning and operating an electrical generating unit. It's underperformed.
Everywhere. Ever.
And everywhere ever.
Ever.
and it's the only technology, mainstream or otherwise, that hasn't gotten better.
Huh.
Every other technology, VCRs get better, whatever. Everything, technology generally, everything always gets better.
Huh.
Nuclear's been the one exception to that rule. It's had a negative learning curve. And we should be very wary of that negative learning curve.
So when you were presenting on the Point LePreau issues at hearings for licensing, etc., you were looking at seismology, its proximity to the ocean, fundamental design flaws.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I found and what happened. Back to when I first got started on this, it was obviously because of Fukushima, so earthquakes was one of the key things I looked at, and I realized that the data that they were using was really old and outdated, and they weren't actually using the right metric to use. They were using median data instead of mean data. And I got them to do an earthquake study for Point LePreau. And it consisted of 2 pieces, a probabilistic piece, but which probabilities have an easy way of being manipulated. There's a lot of uncertainty in them, and they always use 1 in a million chance of whatever. But they did another study. It was called a paleoliquefaction study. Basically, our history of earthquakes in this area, and North America in general only goes back, say, with seismographs, 100 years, and then we have, written records. We've had a gentleman, Ken Burke, in New Brunswick, that's gone back through old newspapers that's identified additional earthquakes and took estimates of their sizes and stuff like that. So we had about 200 or 300 years worth of knowledge of what earthquakes could possibly do here in New Brunswick. This lady, she did what was called a paleolithification study. When there's large earthquakes, it can shake the sand and make these structures in the sand. Basically, the sand can come shooting up kind of through cracks, and this mechanism that she's developed to be able to identify earthquakes and rough sizes of them. So we'd always imagined that there could be a fairly significant earthquake here, but what she found was evidence of actually 3 separate very large earthquakes that have happened near Point LePreau. One about 1,500 years ago, one about 3,000 years ago, and one about 8,000 years ago. So our knowledge of earthquakes in New Brunswick got significantly better with this study, and it showed that the hazard at LePreau was quite large. Like, we get earthquakes are different, but the closer you are to it, the more powerful it is. And the Fukushima earthquake, for example, it was like 150. It was a really big earthquake, but it was actually 150 kilometers away from the Fukushima plant. The earthquakes that they found near LePreau were actually really close to Point LePreau, like within the 20 to 30 kilometer kind of range. And a 7.0 earthquake could cause very similar shaking to what Fukushima got, just because it's a smaller earthquake, but it could happen closer.
Right.
So I'd lobbied for this new study to be done, and found out that they were using mean instead of median data. And if you know anything about statistics, a median data set will ignore that one large outlier.
Right. Yeah.
Which isn't good. That's the earthquake we're concerned about.
Did you present in Ontario on the subject of earthquakes?
No, it was here. They had the hearings here in St. John.
Huh. I guess they were referred to by somebody, I guess.
Yeah.
In Ontario.
And then, and this was really led me to stop dealing with the CNSC and NB Power regarding safety, because I really don't feel, no matter how much effort I put into it, that they won't shut it down because it's unsafe. I really don't think that they will, not with the current regulator that we have. It was like a waste of time. So they found these new earthquakes, 3 previously unknown earthquakes they didn't know about, and also they changed the safety limit. They didn't make the plant safer to make it safe. They changed the limit to make it safe.
That's standard operating procedure. What about the maintenance of Point LePreau? I hear, through the grapevine of some pretty crazy stuff at Point LePreau. I don't know if I should say whatever, but it's... I
hear lots of things too, and I never ever say anything in public about what somebody tells me goes on in there personally, but I know what I deal with. Maintenance-wise, I think that's probably one of the biggest one of the costs people don't realize that's there. It costs a lot of money to staff a nuclear power plant in Canada. I think NB Power's operational and maintenance budget's about $450 million a year.
Yeah.
Point LePreau is like $250 million of that. There's 800 and something people down there all making a lot of money. I know they do have a new guy down. They have an American in charge down there now. I've met him. actually not a bad fellow. He gives me a little bit more confidence in the operation of the place. He's a pretty no-nonsense kind of guy. I've brought up some issues with him. He has did fix them and stuff, and so I get a little bit of respect for the guy that's operating the place now, and I'm glad it's him, if anybody, I guess.
When are you guys scheduled for your next refurb? What is the plan? Because you've refurbed once.
We refurbed once. Well, I guess NB Power just released their integrated resource plan, and this is the first year where they've had to consider what happens when LePreau gets shut down. And their plan, and this is like 25 years out, so whatever, it says replacing in kind.
Wow.
But it's funny, if you look at the levelized cost of electricity that NB Power is using, there's a geothermal resource that's actually quite a bit less expensive than nuclear.
Yeah.
It provides that same kind of always-on base load power that everybody likes about nuclear power.
Yeah.
So if it provides the same kind of function at a cheaper cost, why wouldn't we look at that?
And that's really cheap by comparison, is it not?
Yeah, and the nice thing about the geothermal resources is you can do smaller plants as well.
Right.
You know, for New Brunswick, Point LePreau is too big. It's a big white elephant. You know, it drives a lot of our costs. Whereas these are smaller plants, you can do them in like 50 megawatt kind of thing. So what I've been suggesting in my plan is, you know, let's put up a $50 million or a 50 watt one. It doesn't cost a whole lot. Let's put one in, see how it works. You know, the thing about doing smaller things too is you can get behind a learning curve where you can do one and then another and get better. Yeah. Whereas nuclear power, by the time we were to refurbish LePreau again, all the people that did the first one will be gone.
Yeah.
There's no learning curve there.
Right. It's fascinating. One of the tweets that I always loved was, and this is a few years ago, so it's probably not, the headline isn't true anymore because there's been another relicensing since then, but about 5 or 6 years ago, the CBC headline was, Point LePreau has had 17 fires in its previous license period. 17 fires.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll famously quote Arnie Gunderson, I think, in an intervention he did in Ontario where, you know, operations and maintenance-wise and fires and, you know, the human piece of it, you know, we're one bad day away from an accident. Everything can be going along great, whatever, we can have fires, but we can put them out and all that kind of stuff. You know, we're one bad day where something happens and somebody turns the wrong valve during something that happens and it escalates out of control. You know, you can't shut nuclear power off. So it makes it dangerous.
Well, and you're lucky you've only have one reactor. We like to chain 8 of them together and have at least 4 of them all connected by the same refueling channel. So an accident in one is an accident in all.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about the CNSC, the regulatory agency in Canada.
Wow.
Really, really concerned, but it's like I've put a lot of time into them, and I've actually been fairly successful with them. I have been able to make them a little bit safer, I think. Several things that have been going on. But can't fix that problem with a fundamental change at CNSC. So, you know, I definitely don't put a whole lot of time into dealing with those guys anymore.
Well, a guest that I've had on the show, Dennis Riches from Japan, he's a writer. One of the things he did was to translate a play written in France. And it was a play about presenting at nuclear hearings. So, the idea when you say that, these hearings, are theater, it takes on a new meaning.
Oh yeah, I feel absolutely disgusted every time I participate in one, and again, I'm a solutions-based person. I always hate saying "don't do this." I always want to say "do this" instead. And beating my head against the wall with those guys was it's a lot of work with very little return. I think the best way to get rid of nuclear power is put up windmills.
One thing I'll disagree with in a way, even if your presentation doesn't have the desired effect, there are a crap load of people watching and seeing regular people get up and, do something. It is a form of activism. It does show other people. And what's really fascinating is when I watch these hearings, there's a spectrum from, retired CBC announcer / comedian to crazy kid with a skateboard. And when people watch that spectrum, because you can go ahead and compare them to each other and so on, but it says to people, we don't have to just, turn the channel and ignore, or you can't fight City Hall. Regular people are, doing something about it.
Oh, I'm not suggesting that I was speaking very personally about my own self.
Yeah.
I work a full-time job plus my environmental work, which is kind of like two jobs. So I guess I'm just being selective in what I do and what I think will really make the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah.
But, I know there's a lot of the nuclear movement in Canada is extremely well informed. Extremely well informed. I see people like Vanilla Midgelon and Sean Patrick Stencil and Teresa from SELA and Gordon Edwards and Michelle Duguay. All these people are extremely talented, extremely knowledgeable. Kudos to the whole team.
Well, you were saying that you feel sometimes that your efforts are wasted, and I'm saying that other people watching other people get up and some of them make it look easy, means that other people can, and that back to that perspective of from a public speaker all the way to a crazy kid with a skateboard says, what? It's supposed to be open to the public. At least if you're going to do nothing, have our voices on record. Yeah, for sure. My worst fear is saying I told you so. Ah, yes.
I don't want to be right about the earthquakes.
And the punchline, right. The sort of sad part is that, on the other hand, people have been going to these hearings for decades. I think, men have grown old and gray in front of these hearings.
Yeah. And that's why, my personal choice was to refocus, back to my core fundamentals of my group. It's, it's in the name, solutions. I'm a solutions-based person type thing. So I guess that's why I refocused in the last couple of years. And, I think it's been, the province of New Brunswick's plan is largely my plan, which I'm quite excited about.
Wow. Another thing about the title of your webpage, which we'll mention later, and in the show notes, you put a space between new and clear.
Yes, it's actually not nuclear. It's new and clear. Yes, that's a good point.
It's funny.
Good point to make, and I did that on purpose.
Sure.
It didn't put me into just dealing with nuclear issues, right?
Well, I've been scolded by Dr. Helen Caldecott for saying nuclear. And I say it is not new and it is not clear. And I don't care if I sound like George Bush. You can scold me.
That's why I was quick to correct you to make sure you put the free part in there.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the other, in my name, my company, there was actually a fair amount of thought put into it. The free part, actually, I don't get paid to do any of this work. It's all public interest based, not doing it to make a buck. And it's another piece of the free part.
Yeah. One of the papers that I became used to getting from your site was presentations by Frank Greening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, like I say, the movement in Canada, the opposition to nuclear, extremely well-informed people, like Frank Greening or Sunil Mijawan, or all these people, very technical backgrounds. A lot of them will even say that they're pro-nuclear. They're just pro-safety as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a whole list of things they could fix, and they choose not to because, one, it would cost a couple bucks to do, and two, it kind of means they've overlooked this list of things they need to fix.
And I think that's the most concerning piece to me. The fact that the nuclear industry is very, they won't admit if there's ever been a mistake made kind of thing, or I think I've been fairly effective, with dealing with the CNSC. Several of my changes have come out in legislation. A lot of my earthquake stuff. One thing that's different about trying to change public policy is you never actually get credit for it. When government changes policy, they don't say, "Oh, we're using Chris's policy now, thank you." It just comes out, and that's what the new policy is. And the policies, the Canadian Standards Association's standards for earthquakes for nuclear power plants is changed now, largely because of me. NB Power, like I said, was using median data, and everybody else in the world was using mean. I lobbied to have them put the mean in the legislation, and that changed. So that was really good. And also, the National Building Code changed. The 2015 National Building Code used to use median data as well. It didn't have as big of effect on things because they used a lot higher probabilities. They weren't looking at those outliers anyways, I guess, for the National Building Code. But the National Building Code actually changed in 2015, uses mean data now as well.
A source of pride, no doubt, for you. That's terrific.
Well, I mean, it's a good internal thing. It's not like I get a lot of recognition for it. They don't put it in footnotes in legislation or anything. But I didn't want to make nuclear power safer. I actually want to get rid of it.
Yeah. But if you've got to live with it, then step one is getting them to clean up their act. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, Quebec, they closed 2 nuclear plants. What is with Quebec? Why are they so smart? What is with those people?
I would say New Brunswick has a really good framework, second to none, except for maybe Hydro-Quebec. I mean, there's a really good example of a grid that's 99% renewables. Hydro-Quebec paid the province of Quebec a $2 billion dividend last year. They created billions of dollars worth of economic activity, all kinds of jobs. World-class utility. Hydro-Quebec is probably best utility in the world.
Wow.
and one of them anyways. Really good model to follow. And the only thing that would change from any other utility would be the mix inside. I mean, they're 99% salt hydro, but we can have 95% renewable with a mix of 35% wind, 10% solar, some geothermal. We can do all that too, right?
I don't know if this is still standing, but the Quebec government banned uranium mining in Quebec.
Yeah, I believe so. I haven't followed that issue as closely as...
On the subject of stigma and pride, and this is what pisses me off. I'm ashamed, right? But if you were in Quebec And here, they ban uranium mining. They're 99% renewable. They made big investments. Now they can export this stuff. They're paying dividends. Like when you grab a handful of Quebec dirt, you'd be proud. We can't say that in Ontario.
I think, there's a good model to follow, and, there's a good model not to follow. And I think Ontario, privatization, bad. Efficiency, bad. Nuclear, bad. They're doing all the wrong things. They're, a lot of the places that look really good, sometimes it's not as great as it sounds.
What's up next for you in terms of presentations and stuff you're generating?
I'm currently an intervener in the Energy Utilities Board hearings for NB Power. I do it every year. It's a huge amount of work, and that's really why I kind of stopped doing a lot of other things, because this takes up so much time. There's thousands of documents that you have to read and whatnot, and I'm going to be tackling a couple of things. I guess efficiency. This is the very first time that this reduce and shift demand program has had any kind of oversight from the utility board. So regarding like some of those analysis that I said that I got NB Power to do, where they were going to lose $700 million worth of earnings, that it wasn't going to do much for the environment, it's benefiting very few people. Essentially, it would be much better if NB Power took that money and started putting up some windmills.
Maybe you'll run for premier.
I would prefer president of NB Power.
Does that pay more?
They make a lot more money.
Yeah. So we have the sunshine list here in Ontario. I assume there's one for New Brunswick.
Yes. Well, here's the interesting thing. It was funny. There was a news article in it the other day, and this happened last year at the Energy Utilities Board, in that the president of NB Power is the highest paid public employee in the province, by a little over $500,000 a year. But it's actually untrue. There's another employee that doesn't work directly for the province, but has a contract with the province that makes quite substantially more, almost $750,000. And guess who that is?
I don't know.
The guy in charge of Point LePreau.
Nice.
Makes more than the president.
Nice. Okay. So in Ontario, the trick is that if you hire a middleman to run your government-owned reactor, all those people get removed from the sunshine list.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. And let me ask you this. So there was talk at least a year ago, and I think I might have been blocking this out because it's too annoying, but wasn't Bruce also trying to be the middleman in New Brunswick and operate Point LePreau?
There was some talk about them doing the refurbishment way back when, but that fell through. I mean...
Well, there's the owner and then there's the operator, and Bruce's trick is to be the operator and not the owner.
Yeah.
And with expensive nuclear already, why do we need a middleman? But...
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean... For nuclear, the costs are driven a lot by the regulatory framework. It being so dangerous, it takes a lot of people. They're doing the reports and these management systems which govern the safety of those things. A lot of work. So it costs a lot of money. As far as the solution goes, renewable energy, something like... I think we had talked a little bit about ownership, that, none of our public utilities own windmills.
Right.
Which I think is probably the largest, and, that should be the thing that should be the forefront of Canadian policy. And it isn't even being discussed at all, which is a huge problem. But the operation of the windmills, actually that model kind of works for the solution a little bit. A lot of places, the manufacturer operates and maintains the windmills. That model actually works quite well because they know their own windmills quite well. They can stock their own spare parts kind of thing, and it makes sense.
Local maintenance and manufacturing jobs would be something.
Mm-hmm. Right? Well, I mean, obviously the people that are maintaining it have to be local, even if it is privately operated. It's still going to be local people. They're not going to have somebody from Germany fly in to service a windmill. They're going to have local people, and they're going to train local people. So if private companies are generally better organized, they can probably run more efficient. It would be more than enough to pay them an extra 10% on the O&M side of
It's a little concerning, though, with the private ownership, the incentive being reducing costs and how that impacts safety.
Yeah, and I mean, in a nuclear power plant, I totally agree. It's a different can of worms. Although I haven't dealt as much with Bruce as I have OPG and ND Power, but I get the feeling that they're probably better organized, better run. I think they seem to have their stuff together a little bit better. I can't quantify that very well, just my perception, I guess.
So the remaining places on Earth that are building these crazy plants, Russia and China, they're raging forward, but so we don't get to see their books.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of regulatory framework exists with them? And what kind of public hearings are they going to have?
I don't really know. I like to act locally, think globally.
Yeah.
What they're doing over there doesn't concern me as much, especially in China. They haven't formed a whole lot of... It's such a big problem.
Yeah.
That I'm just not going to even think of it, as long as they're trying to reduce emissions right now in my head. But I think there's solutions. I think when you look to the costs, is the big thing for me. And not only does it cost ratepayers less, but it also sucks up money that could be used on other things.
All right.
So it's got the potential to slow the progress down, I guess, would be my big concern over there.
I'm afraid of an accident over there, and 7 days later, that's the air we're breathing.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to say. I don't really know. I haven't dealt with them over there and what it's like. I suspect I don't know.
It's
I don't
interesting.
know what it's like.
So for a long time, my focus was on other countries' nuclear, because I couldn't face being surrounded by the nuclear plants here, right? And your approach is to not worry so much about China and focus on what's 50 kilometers away from you. Yeah.
And, they're not going to shut Point LePreau down because of a safety reason. I don't think they're going to do that. I think what will happen, if I was to try and look in my crystal ball on what's going to happen with the future of Point LePreau, they've refurbished the internal pieces of it. They've had a lot of issues with the external pieces. I suspect one of these days they'll shut down for their yearly maintenance, and they'll find something, and it'll never start up again.
Wow.
And which is better than the other way it shuts down, big earthquake and whatnot, right? A lot of really important things that I don't think are being discussed a lot, like efficiency. I think a lot of the provinces, and they all seem to be pushing for the efficiency piece, and I think that's something that the official decision makers don't understand. I think it's efficiency is a warm and cozy and cozy kind of thing. How can we go wrong being efficient? I think it's got some pretty serious negative consequences.
And it's because they're attacking the demand side rather than the supply side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're trying to focus on problems instead of solutions.
I hear you. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, David. Talk to you later.
Bye.
That was Chris Rouse of Nuclear Free Solutions. He has been effective in bringing about real change, not just on nuclear safety, but now energy policy in the region in which he lives. Chris Rouse spoke to us from New Brunswick, Canada, by phone.
And for your information,
there has been no collusion, the Trump campaign and Russians, or Trump and Russians, no collusion. The Democrats are all running for office and they're trying to say this, that, but bottom line, they all say there's no collusion. And there is no collusion. There was absolutely no collusion. Everybody knows it. It has been determined that there is no collusion, and by virtually everybody. When they have no collusion, and nobody's found any collusion,
I'm Dave Archer from Toronto.
I'm Chris Rouse from Somerville, New Brunswick.